of your legs, and then we will eat your face right off your head. Do you understand?
Venom is one of the most interesting characters in Marvel Comics. There's been several versions of Venom throughout the comics and movies, and he's gone from literally biting people's heads off to shockingly sacrificing himself to save the entire universe. In this video, we're not just going to be discussing Venom, but we're also going to be going over its original host, Eddie Brock, one of Marvel's most overlooked and tragic characters. Marvel has so much different continuities and stories for Eddie Brock, it's hard to keep track sometimes. For this video, I'll just be going over the original. Eddie started off as a normal journalist with a pretty rough upbringing and a traumatic past. He had an abusive alcoholic father who constantly berated him. One fateful day as a teenager, he stole his father's car and caused an accident. This would result in the death of a young child. This would later haunt Eddie for the rest of his life. Instantly admitting to guilt in the police station where he was questioned, Eddie knew he did a horrible thing and he was ready to pay the price for it. Now this would be a major turning point for Eddie as his father had immense influence in the town they lived in. So much so that he barged into the same room Eddie was being interrogated in, and once he got there he told Eddie to plead innocent. He'd make it so the incident almost never even happened. Eddie initially protested this. He knew he did something wrong, something unforgivable, and he was ready to pay the price. Unfortunately, Eddie's father didn't see it that way. He was worried about what this would do for their family's reputation. Now, Marvel's a pretty messed up universe, but even for them, this is pretty dark. Now, fast forward a little bit, and Eddie's grown into a fully grown adult, and now he's a writer for the Daily Globe. Eddie published an article supposedly exposing the identity of the Sin Eater serial killer. This propelled Eddie to stardom and built up his reputation as a reporter. In the eyes of the public, Eddie had become a hero who brought a monstrous killer to justice. But in reality, he had an untrustworthy source and chose not to verify the information. This resulted in him getting the wrong person convicted, and Spider-Man would later reveal the real identity of the Sin Eater. Eddie got fired from his job as a journalist, and to top it off, his longtime wife also left him. This turn of tragic events caused Eddie to spiral into a deep depression that resulted in him developing a very deep hatred for Spider-Man. On one fateful day, which he believed to be his last, Eddie would be praying inside of a church. The same church where Spider-Man had rejected his Venom symbiote moments prior. That initial Clintar symbiote found Eddie and bonded with him over their shared hatred of Spider-Man. Now there is a bit more to this story, but I don't want to fully make this an Eddie Brock origin story video, so we're just gonna move on to Venom now. For this video, I don't want to go too deeply into the Venom symbiote's origin. I'm pretty sure most of us know the gist of it. The symbiote originates from the planet Clintar, and the way it comes to Earth varies from story to story, but generally its purpose for coming here is always the same, which is looking for a host. Despite this sounding pretty malicious, the Venom symbiote isn't actually inherently evil. At least in most continuities, its morality is often determined by the user it's bonded with. Like in this context, it bonded with Eddie Brock over his negative emotions towards Spider-Man. But the same way Eddie improves and changes as a person later on in the story, the symbiote follows suit. When Eddie and the symbiote first bonded, this was at the peak of his hatred for Spider-Man. The very first thing that they did was try and shove Peter onto a railroad. This was more of a test to see where his strength was at, and when that obviously failed, he went to where Peter and his girlfriend lived in order to threaten her and tell her to warn Spider-Man. Now this is where the true nature of Eddie Brock or Venom really shines, because he had every opportunity to harm or hurt MJ, but he chose not to. Now he did probably traumatize her and give her nightmares, but compared to what he could have done, or what a real villain would have done, I'm gonna have to give Eddie some props on this. Fast forward a little bit, when Eddie does actually end up fighting Spider-Man, during the entire fight, all he does is a monologue for Spider-Man about his pain and basically everything that's happened to him up until this point. Eddie shows his feelings and his true desires to Spider-Man. What Eddie Brock truly wants in this moment, and probably for his entire life, is to be a hero like Spider-Man. The person he hates most is the person that he wants to be. This same fight is also the first time somebody actually gives Eddie an answer to the question that he's been really searching for, what it truly means to be a hero. Taking responsibility for your actions, the very thing that had been beaten out of him by his father when he was a child, the same thing that Eddie had been running from his entire life. The thing that turned Eddie Brock down the path of despair was not Spider-Man, but his own failures to take responsibility for his actions and own his life. This is not something Eddie immediately realizes, because I'm sure even at the end of this comic, Eddie and his symbiote both held a deep grudge against Spider-Man. But as we go through the different stages of Venom, this is definitely something Eddie starts picking up on. Okay, so now we're going to be jumping into a different version of Venom and Eddie Brock. Like I said at the start, there's tons of different continuities for Venom and Eddie, but they all, or at least most of them, do touch upon the same character when it comes to a moral standpoint and the real purpose of this video. Why does Venom bite people's heads off? This is something that Venom's been known for throughout the years, and there is a really good explanation as to why Eddie even still allows the symbiote to do this. Venom originates from the planet Clintar, and it's an alien organism that needs an essential nutrient known as phenylethylamine. Bro, I don't even know if I can pronounce that, but it's a nutrient that can be found in two main things: brains and chocolate. Let me explain. Whenever Eddie runs out of the nutrient, he starts to lose control of the symbiote, and it also causes Eddie's health to suffer immensely. He starts to have physical and mental breakdowns, so a lack of phenylethylamine, or the nutrient, affects the health of the host as well. The next thing I'm about to say has never been officially stated in the comics or any real Marvel material, but we can affirm that the nutrient plays a key role in maintaining a healthy connection between the host and the symbiote. The way Eddie learned about the nutrient was also pretty gruesome because after he refused to consume any sort of humans for a while, Eddie started to have regular breakdowns, which caused him to go to a doctor known as Teddy Payne, and with her help they figured out that the cause of the problem was this chemical, or rather chemical starvation, which is basically just a lack of the nutrient. And this entire situation ultimately led Eddie to discovering chocolate, which also contained the same nutrient and basically became an alternative to brains. So while eating people is still definitely something a villain would do, when it comes from a moral standpoint, it's something the symbiote essentially just needs to survive. So basically from Venom's perspective, if somebody's committed a crime and it needs its brains to survive, it thinks it's completely fine. Obviously, we as humans can tell that somebody doesn't necessarily deserve to get eaten for like robbing a bank or beating someone up, but the symbiote really can't. Or at least initially it couldn't, because when it bonded with Eddie, it started to gain his moral compass, and part of Eddie started to imprint onto the symbiote. He basically helps Venom understand what's right or wrong, from the perspective of a human being. This is what I believe causes the symbiote to shift from being a mindless beast to an intelligent creature. Now this goes back to what we were talking about before. The reason Eddie Brock even ended up bonding with the Venom symbiote was because of Spider-Man. To put it more bluntly, it was because of their shared hatred of Spider-Man. And as Eddie started to change his feelings and started to take responsibility for the state of his life, the symbiote followed suit. This eventually led Eddie and the symbiote to let go of their grudge against Spider-Man. One of the biggest turning points in Venom's story. Up until now, Venom wasn't just violent, he was bitter, broken, and obsessed with revenge. Letting go of that hatred was the first time he truly started to heal. Now this doesn't mean Venom becomes a perfect good guy who has no flaws or doesn't make mistakes, but it is the first time Eddie, or now Venom, starts to actually act like a proper hero. And I think one of the biggest telltale signs of Venom's character growth is his numerous teamed ups with Spider-Man. The first time Venom and Spider-Man ever teamed up was back in the original Amazing Spider-Man series, and we're going pretty back for this one. This run started in 1963, and the Venom from this era is a lot different from the Venom that we know nowadays. This story, while locked up, Eddie unintentionally leaves behind a piece of his symbiote, which ends up bonding with the psychotic serial killer Cletus Cassidy. I don't want to go too deep into Cletus's lore, but all you really need to know is that Carnage is essentially the offspring of Eddie's Venom, and with the way symbiotes work, the offspring is almost always stronger than the original, and Cletus and Carnage end up escaping prison, going on a rampage, and even defeating Spider-Man. This leads to Peter teaming up with Johnny Storm in order to find Eddie Brock and Venom, who are living in seclusion on some island. Once they land on the island, Johnny and Spider-Man are instantly confronted by Venom, who by the mere sight of Spider-Man is instantly provoked into attacking them. After calming him down and defeating Venom using a sonic wave gun, they explain the situation. And after hearing of the innocents getting involved and affected by his, yet indirect mistake, Venom reluctantly agrees to help defeat Carnage, and the very first Venom Spider-Man team up is formed. In the midst of their battle, Carnage starts to use underhanded tactics and even ends up endangering an innocent child. And this further goes to showcase Venom's true values, because despite everything he's done, when it comes to protecting innocent people, especially children, Venom doesn't hesitate. He instantly lunges to save the child. But despite this, it's important to note the Venom we see at this stage isn't completely the same Eddie Brock we see in the more recent comics, because the exact moment Carnage is defeated, he instantly lunges to attack Spider-Man, and thankfully Reed Richards does show up and stops him. On the bright side, this is still an overall net positive for Venom. The next thing I want to touch up upon briefly is Eddie's time as the Anti-Venom. So like this video is mainly focused on Venom as the original symbiote, plus Eddie Brock, so Anti-Venom doesn't fully count, but I still think it's worth touching up upon. Essentially what happened, to quickly summarize, is Eddie Brock got cancer and the symbiote sensed its host was dying and it ended up leaving him. In this weakened and dying state, Eddie starts to really reflect upon himself and his life choices. This leads to him accepting his flaws and spending his last bit of time on Earth volunteering at a homeless shelter. The homeless shelter is coincidentally also run by Martin Lee, aka Mr. Negative, and Mr. Negative offers to heal Eddie using his power. Mr. Negative offers to heal Eddie using his positive energy, but Eddie is unaware of the fact that since he's Mr. Negative, he also has negative energy, which ends up interacting with his leftover mutated Venom cells and creating the Anti-Venom, a symbiote that's entire purpose is to destroy other symbiotes. One of the most unique things about Anti-Venom is the fact that Eddie can actually heal and cure people in this state. It honestly changes Eddie Brock for the better. For his entire life, all he wanted to be was the hero, but due to the nature of his symbiote, he'd always have to have that negative caveat. Now you could probably guess with how I'm hyping this up, or if you've read the Amazing Spider-Man comics, that this doesn't really end well for Eddie. Or I mean, it kind of does. Let me explain. In the 2011 Spider Island storyline, a massive spider virus outbreak is causing havoc. Every person that gets infected with this virus is mutated into a spider-like monster, and every hero in New York City is trying to figure out how to stop it. Eddie Brock, who at this point is solidified as the Anti-Venom, realizes his healing powers are capable of curing people who have the virus. With time running out and people actively falling victim to the chaos, Eddie makes the ultimate sacrifice and chooses to burn out his symbiote in order to heal the numerous thousands that have fallen victim. He's hailed as the hero of New York, not as Venom or Anti-Venom, but as Eddie Brock. And despite Eddie losing his powers, this wasn't as tragic of a moment for him, because he finally got to be the hero he'd always wanted. Instead of Spider-Man saving the day, this time it was Eddie Brock. And I know this video is meant to talk about the original Venom, but I still wanted to bring the story up just because it's such a pivotal point for Eddie's character and him showcasing humility to give up his symbiote superpowers for the sake of other people, and this is a perfect example of his character development and growth. Fast forward, and now Eddie Brock has reunited with his original symbiote and he has a son to look after. But he's also getting hunted by a super powered version of Carnage. In this story, Carnage, who's bonded with Cletus Cassidy, is attempting to get in contact with the symbiote god Null. But the thing is, Cletus was originally dead in this timeline, but he was revived through the power of Null, so this time around he has his original Carnage symbiote and Null symbiote, so he's a lot stronger and a lot more sadistic than normal. He's also after the codex of every symbiote, which is basically like a trace of the symbiote that they leave behind after they've bonded with a host. Something I should probably mention as well, Eddie's son doesn't actually know that he's his son, and this is because Eddie believes anything and anyone that gets close to him will end up eventually getting harmed. After nearly escaping from Carnage and witnessing his son almost dying, Eddie realizes there's only one person that can help. You guessed it, Spider-Man. After meeting up with Spider-Man as they're discussing their next course of action, a group of robbers instantly bursts into the diner, which obviously does not end well for the criminals as Peter dispatches them pretty easily. But as they're fighting, Eddie and Peter figure out that they need a way to extract the codexes before Carnage, bringing Eddie to another individual from his past, the Maker. This is like an evil alternative version of Mr. Fantastic, except in this timeline he isn't really that evil, and the Maker created the machine they needed already, which he said he only needs a few hours to complete. This is also where Eddie meets Peter's godson named Norman, who's I'm pretty sure the grandson of Norman Osborn, and he also introduces Dylan as his little brother, which further solidifies Eddie's desire to make sure Dylan does not learn who his actual father is. Norm was previously infected with the Carnage symbiote, making him a codec and target as well, as the first person the Maker is going to test his machine on. Or at least he planned to until Spider-Man and Eddie stepped in. They obviously don't want to risk an innocent child's life, so they stepped in and decided to go after another codec. Someone they thought would be Carnage's next target, the original Norman Osborn. Random fact, they're also accompanied by John Jameson, who's also the son of Jonah Jameson. He's actually a security guard. As they arrive before Norman's cell, Carnage uses his powers to make sure everyone in the prison, including John, go insane. It's not really specified what he did, but you guys can tell off these panels that this version of Carnage is pretty fucking strong. Carnage eventually gets his hands on Norman, and in front of Eddie and Spider-Man devours Norman Osborn into his symbiote. Eddie and Peter barely escape and realize that they aren't enough to deal with this Carnage alone, so they decide to get the other heroes like Captain America and Wolverine involved. And right after this entire ordeal, Eddie receives a phone call from the Maker, giving us one of the biggest plot twists in the entire story. Eddie's son Dylan turns out to be a codec himself. For some context, his wife Anne was initially thought to be a codec that Carnage had already gotten, but apparently she didn't have it on her when she died, so when she gave birth to Dylan, he basically inherited it. This is probably one of the most terrifying moments of Eddie's life. This entire time, it's been pretty heavily emphasized that Eddie didn't want to involve Dylan into this type of life. He didn't want Dylan to have to carry the burden of being Eddie Brock's son. But with him being a codec, it's basically unavoidable. Dylan is now forced into this entire conflict. Though Eddie doesn't let this hold him back or crush him, instead his son being a target for Carnage fuels Eddie and makes him work even harder to stop Carnage and Null. This leads Eddie to Carnage's next victim, which is Scorpion, aka Mac Gargan. In the process of saving Scorpion, Miles Morales is infected by the Carnage, turning him into one of the infected. In the midst of the chaos, Eddie tries to convince Norman to come with them and break free for the sake of his grandson. While Venom just wants to kill him, they are both at odds and separate with each other mid-fight. Eddie doesn't want to kill anyone else. Instead, he'd rather go and save Mac. This is one of the most impactful moments in the history of Venom and Eddie Brock, as Eddie walks away to go save Mac. The symbiote comes back and bonds with Eddie once again. It's honestly the best panel to represent and describe Eddie and Venom's growth as characters. But let's continue with the story. After saving Scorpion, Eddie reunites with Spider-Man and the other heroes. After reuniting with Dylan and getting ready to move on to the next phase of their plan, Eddie and Peter are having a heart-to-heart talk where Peter encourages him to tell Dylan that he is his father. But as they're talking, the real Eddie tells Peter to watch out as Carnage reveals himself. In the chaos, the Venom symbiote has enough and decides to leave Eddie for the Hulk in order to defeat Carnage. This leads to Venom, Hulk, and Carnage duking it out while Eddie and Peter escape into an underground bunker. There, Eddie resolves to go ahead and fight. Realizing that he's lost his symbiote and now became powerless, Eddie decides that he wants to use the last bit of his life to protect the sleeping Kodak heroes. Despite Peter's protest, Eddie goes out there and faces the symbiote head on. Not just as Venom, but as Eddie Brock. In the chaos, he manages to help Miles escape Carnage's control, partially because the real Carnage is preoccupied with the Venom Hulk, and as they rush to the fight, Hulk seems to be defeated and Carnage takes control of the original symbiote. But before Eddie can lose hope, the Avengers arrive and he realizes he's not alone in this fight. For most of his existence as Venom, Eddie was perceived as a villain, and like most villains, he operated alone. He had a few friends here and there, but nobody really to fight with him. This is the first time Eddie could really rely on someone. And as everyone's fighting, Eddie senses something deep underground. He finds the symbiote codexes extracted from the other heroes and bonds with them in order to deal with the Carnage threat. This leads into Eddie and Carnage's final battle. They fight it out until Carnage eventually gets to his son. In a final moment of anger and desperation, Eddie finally relents and finishes off Carnage and Cletus by piercing him through the stomach. With this being a bittersweet ending as Null still ended up awakening, but everyone on Earth was still left safe. Dylan also found out that he was in fact Eddie's son. Oh, by the way, before we continue, for anyone that's interested, the storyline does continue with the King in Black series, but we're going to end it off with this. In this video, we've journeyed through almost the entirety of Eddie Brock and Venom's lives. At least Eddie, I'm pretty sure Venom's like 1,000 years old. But anyways, we've seen them go from crazed villain seeking revenge to a lost father looking for solace. It's fair to say Venom at this point in the story can't even be considered a villain or an anti-hero anymore. Eddie Brock at the end of the day really was a hero. I do want to thank everybody for watching the video for as long as they did, and obviously we couldn't touch up upon everything Venom related as this character's been around for 37 years, but I hope you guys enjoyed and got to learn a little bit more about Eddie and his symbiote. Make sure to like and subscribe as this video took a while to record.